Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. In this podcast, I caught up with Brian Anderson to talk about cultivation through the eyes of an architect. How do we design our facilities to be compliant with local laws? How can we be more efficient in our designs and layouts? How does the methodology of different grow styles impact your design? Brian covers all this and much more. Brian is a founding partner of Anderson Porter Design, an international practice focused on design and architecture for the cannabis industry. Anderson Porter Design provides strategy, technology, design, and thought leadership built on 20 years as a general practice in architecture. Since 2014, they are focused on buildings for plants, controlled environment horticulture, extraction, manufacturing, and retail dispensaries. Brian merges an RISD education in the craft tradition of making and designing objects with an analytic, data-driven process to drive value along with the cannabis supply chain. He has a master's degree from Harvard and has been in practice since 1992. Anderson provides professional leadership in strategic planning and design. He speaks nationally on energy sustainability in the cannabis industry, facility design, and on interior design for retail. Now, on to the show. Hey, Brian, thanks for taking the time to chat today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here, Tad. Thank you.
Yeah, now I met you at Photo X this past year. It's a little crazy to think about how we used to get together for conferences right now with this quarantine going on. But I really enjoyed chatting with you, and I wanted to talk to you about this sort of architecture perspective that you have on cultivation. Can we start off just giving listeners a little bit of your background and talking a little about who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I'm in Arlington, Massachusetts, suburb of Cambridge and Boston. So I'm an architect and principal of Anderson Porter Design. We've been an architect for 26 years. And 20 of those years really as a general practitioner, if you will. And it was sort of in that mix of projects that we'd done that things came together back in 2014. They say that luck is the intersection of preparedness and opportunity. So that opportunity came for us in 2014, and the preparedness was just that very specific things in our background as architects that we had done. We had been we're in Eastern Massachusetts, and a lot of around us is biotech, biopharm, and the like, and medical device manufacturing. So we have done a lot of work in medical device manufacturing, and those are clean room environments. Those are staff that wear Tyvek suits and hairnets and beard nets. So that really lined up in the cannabis space. We had been the architects for the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which is a pretty big role to play from 1999 to 2006. And so if you remember, September 11, 2001 happened right in there. So we had a very deep background in both physical and electronic security as it relates to facilities. And so in 2014, a lot of folks coming to us had, never spoken to the chief of police before, let alone the fire marshal. Those have been people traditionally to be avoided. We came along and we were somebody who could speak to their language. And we also spoke the language of biopharm and clean rooms. We had a background in retail. So we actually practice in a lot of retail work in cannabis as well. So since 2014, that has now taken off. We had our first group here in Massachusetts. We now we opened up a virtual office in Orange County, Fullerton, California this year in 2020. We do projects in Central Europe, North Macedonia, as well as throughout the United States.
Wow, that's great. I really enjoyed chatting with you because you had a totally different perspective on cultivation than I did. My focus has always been on, primarily on soil biology and that aspect of cultivation, but you really came at it from sort of a regulatory perspective, a structural and workflow perspective that I thought was sort of unique Can you talk a little bit about sort of what an architect's perspective is regarding a facility? Like,
Sure.
where do you start the conversation when you talk to a grower? Because as a grower, a lot of times you're coming from a background like mine, you don't really think about these sorts of things in detail.
It's funny. I'll answer it, and I think it's important to understand that this is not necessarily an architect's point of view. Mine comes from, in addition to what I sort of described there quickly as my background. When I talk to growers about how to approach the grow, it comes from a knowledge in lean manufacturing. We do a lot in our work. I didn't mention that earlier, but it influences how we look at cultivation from a workflow and work practice perspective. As well as, so in lean, if you know lean in manufacturing and lean in enterprise, i.e. business, it's about organizing things to eliminate waste. And so we look at cultivation facilities and manufacturing facilities for weed. Manufacturing is anything from pills to vape cartridges to pre-rolls. If there's an efficient flow to the work. And so we line up the steps that you take by interviewing, right? So we interview the grower to understand how they grow, what's important, what soil media they use, cocoa versus rock wool versus living soil, and then begin to arrange the spaces needed for people to do work. So everything from, let's arrange the shipping bay and the receiving bay so that we have a quarantine space. Everybody today, due to COVID, we all sort of understand quarantine in a new way and how important that is. You don't want to bring in some distributor's junk and, beetle encased in a wooden pallet into your grow. And so, we're thinking about factors that are related to the grow, but that affect work and affect the health and maintenance and safety ultimately of how to protect the plant. So we're kind of weaving in things that we learned from lean and efficiency and work process to the physical things like how to build a quarantine room so that you can push things effectively in from the shipping bay, the dirty side, and pull things out from the clean. Let's say your harvest corridor is a clean corridor where people are observing, good manufacturing practices and good agricultural practices. So they've already been through the workforce comes in through an air pressure zone or an airlock, and they may have gowned up in a Tyvek suit, and so that those two worlds kind of don't overlap, that they're always separated. That's one way that we look at breaking down the work into its parts.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up a quarantine space. That was something that I was hoping you would address. I think it's one of those things that sometimes gets overlooked in facilities or when people try to adapt buildings that weren't originally designed. I mean, if you're building from the ground up, it's pretty easy. But if you're having to come into a space that's already been built, that is a challenge. But I can't agree with you more that that's such an important aspect of it. And then when you talk about lean, interestingly enough, I've had a gentleman, Ben Hartman, on the podcast talking about the lean farm, kind of looking at outdoor farming from a lean perspective, which was a big mental gap for me versus, this more facility-based manufacturing perspective. And there's really a balance in there, but a lot of growers don't think about the fact that, when you're growing by yourself on a medical side with 25 lights, maybe you and one other person, you don't really need to think about your workflow as much. But when you try and expand that to 10, 15, 20 times that size, workflow, the number of steps you take in the day, the number of times you have to handle a particular material, that waste adds up really, really fast and takes up a lot of time. That's a really good point.
Yep. Yeah. Anybody who's ever been a grunt on a construction site, or anybody who's ever been a grunt in a farming environment knows that, your boss says, pick that pile up and move it over there. And then after lunch, you're told, pick that pile up and move it over there. Right. And if you've ever been in that situation, that's completely not lean. Right. moving things once, knowing, never setting something down on the floor is a really good thing to think about. Wow, right? Think about an organized workspace where nothing ever gets set down on the floor, because that's just time to set it down, time to move around it, pick it back up. If we could eliminate that, think of how many more transplants you could do, right? How much time does it take to take a clipping from a mom and put it into an easy clone machine, right? How quickly can you do that? And if you're growing 25 plants, it's no big deal. You don't think about it. But if you've got 100,000 plants, and you just, one crew just broke down a room and harvested it, and your job is to populate it now in the same day, so time doesn't slip on the schedule. How much time does it take to put, 1,500 clones in an easy cloner and move the ready ones out? All that takes time, and so you want to eliminate wasted steps.
Yeah, one of the examples that Ben gives when he gives his talk to a smaller audience is he'll bring a bunch of envelopes, and he'll have people come up front, and he'll have one group do the envelopes, like putting a stamp on them, sealing them, putting the letter in. All without setting down the envelope, go through all the steps at once. And then the other group will do the whole thing. Well, they'll stuff the envelope, and they'll stuff 50 envelopes, and then they'll go back and they'll lick and close 50 envelopes, and then they'll add the stamp. And you would think that doing the same motion over and over again, like the second option there of doing all 50 stuffing at once would be faster, but it takes so much longer because you're having to retouch and set down these envelopes so many times. It's a really cool thought experiment that anyone can try at home, kind of thing. It's kind of fun.
There are so many of those. In many ways, we call them design games. They're sort of interactive games that use game theory to teach fundamental lessons. And so, I'm involved in doing a lot of those teaching exercises for Lean. We have one called the airplane game, and you have a team with Legos to assemble this airplane. You're told exactly how many Legos to use, and the rules set it up so that it's very similar to the envelope stuffing game, which teaches that lesson that the fewer times you pick something up and put it down, and the better the communication amongst the team that's doing something, you can eliminate enormous amounts of time. And it's not always intuitive. Many, many times it's counterintuitive. You think, right? If you rely on your gut, we often get things wrong in terms of thinking about what takes the most time versus what would be a shorter way to do it. Yep.
Yeah, and when you say time, we're not talking about rushing or moving faster necessarily than the other group. We're talking about just moving more efficiently, and I think that's important. It's not about speeding up the employee. It's just about making the steps that they're having to take less time.
That's right. And that comes up, so in facility design around grow facilities, breaking it down all the way to its parts. I know that many people will feel forced to accept things that you may actually be able to change. I mean, those could be things like walls, right? Many people don't think to move the wall, right? But when you think about the amount of money that's being spent and the amount of money at stake, moving and rearranging walls within a building can improve workflow, right? Many times we accept the way things are, like, well, this building only has 600 amps. Right? I could really use 1,200 amps, but it only has 600, so I'm only going to make my grow fit. Many times those have to do with money, right? Everything's impacted by money. But a lot of the work of architecture is to break down a lot of things that are assumed and challenging those assumptions so that we can change things and adapt them so that ultimately the finished product works in the most effective and efficient manner.
Yeah, so I want to ask, so what are some of the common pitfalls that you see when coming onto a project like this from your perspective? I mean, you already mentioned one of as a grower feeling limited by the structure in front of you that may actually be adaptable if you can kind of step out of that box. But what other things might you see in terms of that perspective?
You mentioned it earlier, which is this idea of understanding regulations. So as an architect, we're trained to look at things from the point of view of who's regulating it, right? So OSHA, for example, the Occupational Safety and Hazard, of workers, protecting worker safety. So we look at OSHA, we look at building codes, establishing how to get out of a, building the most quickly, right? So we look at, in case of a fire. So we look at things through the eyes of the fire marshal, or we look at things through the eyes of our state regulator, like the cannabis regulator in each state is going to want to see certain things. And so we start from that, because we know that that's an absolute. If we don't pass that inspection, it was all for naught, right? So we have to do that. So we take those and we order things around life safety, right, and then health. So that has to do with choosing of wall materials so that they comply with, being able to be wiped down. We talk about aseptic conditions, right? Floor materials, wall materials, ceilings, making sure that we can put ceilings in, so that, because it's, how impossible it is to clean around ductwork, right? So you don't want to messy, all that duct and junk up above your plants. And so what else? So we think about it in terms of, where sprinkler heads, all that sort of stuff, right? So how do we mix the life safety from the systems to the life safety from the building materials, and then flow of work? Ordering the group, so ordering the number of rooms, grow rooms, how many should there be? That's where we work very, very closely with growers to establish their grow pattern, because that has to do with the fundamental units of work. How many clone rooms, how many veg rooms, how many mom rooms? Thinking about, well, is it really just one, or should we make it two? So what happens if something happens to your mom's, right? And you need to clean that room out. What do you do when you're cleaning out your mom room, right? You need another one for the overflow. To making sure that the veg room is sized properly to handle the number of throughput for your final flower count, to establishing exactly the right room dimensions for the flower rooms, how based on number of lights, or based on whether you're using tiered, pip style, movable benches, or whether you're using a flat GGS roll top. All of those things have dimensional requirements, right down to door sizes. I don't know what to say is the most, what comes into play the most common, but I don't know. It's fun having, it's for me professionally, it's very fun having a certain set of skills that I learned as an architect and finding them really, really adaptable to, when talking to growers, right? And thinking about, let's make this door 42 inches wide instead of 36. It'd be easier to get a cart through it. And the response is like, oh yeah, like we can do that, right? We don't have to bang our knuckles on the door jambs every time we're pushing a cart through. So sometimes it's really simple things like that, to where to put an RFID, batch reader, or how to work with and how to integrate data collection, so that a grow could, accelerate through big data, essentially through data collection and machine learning. Everything from the tech side to the sort of fundamental or, concrete side of how wide to make a door. It's hard to say which precedes the other, but putting them all in order is a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's one thing we've thought about with the type of growing that we do is if you're growing in a bed, if you do need to remove a bed from a room and it fits nicely on a pallet, how do we have a door frame that allows us to move the pallet in and out with a pallet jack, which saves a ton of time. You don't want to get to the door and then have to shovel it, through that door space. Right. So that's a really important consideration. Are you finding though that regulations always line up with optimal cultivation practices? Do you have any good example of a time when regulation kind of limited the ability of a cultivation facility or a grower to really do what they want to do?
I'll point to a recent one. I think the state of Illinois has stepped in it in a bad way when they outlawed outdoor growing. Right, the state of Illinois, in their latest issue, has made it not possible for farmers to grow cannabis outdoor in the state of Illinois. Think about what that does from a carbon perspective, right? That means that all cannabis grown in the state of Illinois has to be grown indoor under lights, or in a closed greenhouse with a mixed light, right? It would be very efficient to grow outdoors. Like soybean growers and corn growers in Illinois aren't complaining about the DLI and the weather. They're doing just fine. So why wouldn't cannabis be allowed to grow outdoors? So I do think that state law affects in a big way what we do as an industry and what we're able to do as an industry. So I'm going to, make an easy prediction that a lot more carbon is going to be consumed in Illinois with, light fixtures and construction and all the things that, if your grow plan is to produce, for a broad spectrum distillate, and you're going to be, extracting everything, then outdoor would be a, great way to do that and save costs and save energy costs. But the state of Illinois has outlawed that. That's one example. Another, maybe the one that gets a lot of press is that 36 watt per square foot, and that came out of the Massachusetts regulation, so my home state. And the jury's out as to whether its intent is clear. Its intent was to limit high pressure sodium lamps, right? The use of high pressure, it was to limit the use of high pressure sodium, HPS, double-ended HPSs. And that, puts a cramp in a lot of people's style. If your knowledge base entirely was based on growing under HPS, then that requirement is going to seem completely foreign. It does allow for it does not technically disallow high pressure sodium, but if it spreads the lights out too far, if a 5.5 foot grid is just not acceptable, it has to be a 4 by 4.5. That may exceed the lighting power density. But there's other things that can be done, and there are ways in which that can be utilized. But that I don't know if, it's a deep rabbit hole to get into, is the differences between LED and HPS, but that's one area in which the law is trying to mess around and has a lot of growers twisted around the axle.
Yeah, I think it also raises your cost potentially too, as traditionally LED lights are going to be more expensive than
that's right.
double-end HPS. And there's such a range of quality in the LED market right now. It's gotten a lot better, but I do know that people have made poor lighting decisions for an entire facility and come to regret it. Which actually brings me to another point that you brought up in our email exchange, which was around the idea of growers picking a path and sort of sticking to it. Can you kind of elaborate on that and kind of what you meant?
Yeah, sure. So, one role that I play often with groups is trying to avoid going to trade shows and falling in love with the newest, shiniest object, right? There are, in the past 6 years, it seems like every 3 months a new piece of equipment comes to market, and that can be really distracting. So the newest, shiniest object, comes out at a trade show, and we have spent an inordinate amount of time researching that newest thing and really chasing it to ground to find out it may not even be UL listed, right? Or it doesn't have certain, it's not listed on the DLI index of approved lighting, or it's, right, that following really, how do I put this? Like sticking to traditional grows and not venturing out into new technology is usually a wise decision, right? Getting to scale on with achievable means is important, as opposed to trusting in one piece of technology as a solution. I don't know if that's quite answered your question.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, in my experience, the cannabis industry has some of the best marketers and I guess I would almost say like snake oil salesmen when it comes to promoting a product. And a lot of times you'll find that these products are unproven. They don't have the science to back them up. And like you mentioned, they may not even meet regulatory requirements. And so you will find a grower that will go and that's building a facility, will go and see something And we've been, I don't know, lights are probably the easiest example of this. But the idea of scaling a facility and making such a large investment in an unproven technology is, I think, really, really challenging. Even
Right.
when they give it to you at a discount, which I see that happen quite a bit with these facilities too, is they're like, well, this one company is going to give me a pretty good deal on these lights or on this technology. I'm going to give it a shot. It's risky. Like you said, it's very risky.
So one of those, yeah. So I've been there's a new game in town in the past couple of years, which is foreign investors who have set up companies in the U.S. and the hook that you call it, that the snake oil salesman uses, is, oh, we're going to finance this for you, right? Because they know that getting finance for this facility is one of the main hurdles to getting open. And if a salesman comes along and says, hey, we got this new technology and we're going to finance it for you, it becomes really easy trap to fall into. And that's something to be very wary of. There are groups out that are making their products seem like they've solved everything, but when you get under the hood, you realize, oh, you can never change out the lights. What if that light isn't really what you want? Can't change it, right? Because it's part of a machine that you bought that's, designed to grow weed for you, and it's all automated and it's all built into the box, and you can't change it. So yeah, there's a lot of things coming to market that need to be investigated. So I repeat that. Don't invest a massive amount of money and hinge your success on an unproven technology.
Yeah. Now, I do like the idea, if there's room in the facility, to have sort of an R&D space that allows you to trial different things that may or may not be improvements on your current facility structure. I don't know if that's something that you're able to design into many of the buildings that you're working on.
I put that into the best-in-class category. If we have space, if we have a client with a grow team who acknowledges the need for R&D, that for me are the best facilities we've designed, and I'll tell you why. So let's say that you've represented to your investors what your yield is going to be, right, based on the number of plants and the strains and your narratives, your grow narratives. If you then can afford the space to have 2 or 3 rooms set aside that you can call them R&D rooms, you're going to do a couple of things for that grow facility. You're going to give your grower and your organization the ability to test new strains, bring new products to market, investigate and fool around in a positive way that's not detracting from your yields that your investors are counting on. Number 2, and this is the hidden benefit of having an R&D space, is that becomes a relief valve, a kind of sacrificial space. If something goes wrong in your general population, you could evacuate a room and move it into one of those R&D spaces, sacrificing everything in there, right? Throwing that out to save what is your core crop that harvest, right? That's a thing that might not be thought about in the first order, but it comes into play more often than not, right? How many people had something go wrong, but you've got nowhere to put it, right? If you could just empty out that room and actually put it in a vacant room, you'd save the crop. And that's why I think having an R&D space, even though you may not want to sacrifice it, in a pinch you could, and that's one of those hidden benefits.
Yeah, I know from working closely with Gold Leaf, they have 5 or 6 flower rooms. I can't remember offhand, and they're all essentially identical. And while they don't have a dedicated R&D space based on the limitations of the facility and their production needs, they are able to do research in a given room every cycle, looking at ways of being innovative. So testing out a different irrigation system, in this case, looking at the blue mats versus the way they were hand watering, allowed them to see an ROI, that their return on investment by switching the whole facility over was going to save them, thousands of dollars in labor over the course of whatever given period they had established for their ROI. Or,
Sure.
Making a lighting change in one room allows them to decide if that lighting change should be made across the entire facility.
Right.
without risking your entire crop and without risking, too much of your profits at the end of the day to make a change. And I love that idea, because to commit fully to a new technology or a new innovation or even a new workflow, I think is risky without some research, some actual data to back up and support what you're doing.
That's right. That's right. And that's, from a lighting perspective, it's also important to realize that your mechanical systems that are balancing your relative humidity, temperature, and vapor pressure deficit are really balanced based on the heat output. And many of those set points for HPS don't work for LED. So there has to be, so whenever those changes are made, or if those changes are anticipated, it must be understood that the set points on the mechanical systems have to be adapted. Otherwise, the room is going to behave entirely the wrong way under the new light under a new light choice.
Sure. Now, if you're going from, let's just say, from double-ended HPS to LED, wouldn't you essentially have overbuilt your facility so your set points would drop, but you could still use the equipment that you had in place? It's just more than you would need, I would think, or do you have a different experience or thought?
I'll just say that each case is unique. In some ways, you've overbuilt, but in some ways, it's an entirely new animal. It's not just that you're dialing it back; it's that your sensible loads and your latent loads may have changed dramatically. And so, when you think about leaf temperature, right, in those two different environments, you really need to balance that with and this is where I don't want to overstep my professional limits. I'm not a professional engineer. I do know that leaf temperature and set points make a huge difference in crop performance, and that it's a delicate balance when you're talking about the performance of the systems that maintain that. So it's not always as easy as just resetting the automation system or whatever's your controllers that are controlling those the temperature and relative humidity. Sometimes it needs to look at how well it's dehumidifying and testing that to be assured that all the parts are working together.
Now, when you talk about changes in technology, like lighting, for example, one of the other things that we discussed was some of these new styles of growing. Like, what about a facility that wants to bring in multi-tier racking into an existing room, or even a new facility? What are some of the challenges associated with these types of cultivation methods?
So cost goes up enormously, simply because the cost of multi-tier racking is much greater than single-tier benching. But two, the cost of air distribution goes up, right? So if you think about a typical room with a single-tier bench, you can drop air in from your system at the top, right, and circulate that around and recycle it back through the either rooftop unit or however you're handling your air handling unit. In a multi-tiered system now, you need to get air into that space between racks as well. You can't just drop it in from the top and hope to cool evenly and evenly distribute the air throughout over all the plants. So that is one thing that drives up cost as well. So cost is one big hurdle, but there are huge efficiencies that go up. To grow, right? You can double your plant count, or maybe 1.5 times your plant count. But you have differences in labor, right? There's some adjustments that have to be done. One thing we advise people to do if they're thinking about doing two-tiered racking systems is to start out in half the rooms, right? If you're going in a phased approach, always start out with the method that you're going to employ in the future, right? In the future phases. So instead of thinking about just doing single tier racks as your phase one and then two tier racks as your phase two, rather start out with half the number of rooms but do the two tiered racks, and that way your labor becomes familiar with the process, and then when you increase to your phase two, you don't have to learn something new. I think that's true. Yeah, fundamentally, if you are constrained for space and want to increase your yields, the only way to go is up, right? To multi-tier things. I think you probably understand that implicitly in the veg, in the case of veg plants, right? I mean, almost everybody tiers their veg plants because that gives you more room for flower, and so, right, that's the same thinking. Now, we do it in cases where we're retrofitting former use buildings. We do a lot of our work. Maybe half of our work is retrofit versus new builds. And when in an existing building, if you have space limitations but you don't have height limitations, then going up is a natural solution. So you build, you have higher yields per square foot. I have not done a 3-tier grow yet, but we've done a lot of 2-tiered grow on pip style racking systems. And
have you seen any of those in flower rooms? Yeah, I do see a lot in veg. I think it makes a lot of sense in veg. When we talk about flower, though, have you seen this successful with anyone doing purely organic production?
In 2 tiers?
Yes.
So I have not personally. I work with Mike Zartarian, who and he's been my counsel on a lot of things, no-till soil and organic living soils. And what I've learned from him is that it's harder to manage because if you ever have to change that out, that's just the weight and volume of soil on 2 levels is a bear, and that's been one of my main takeaways. That's just stuck with me, right? If that it's harder to work with organic and living soil on 2 levels. So I haven't done it.
Okay, I was just curious if you'd seen it. I know there's a few people doing it right now, but it has yet to be really proven to me. If there's an existing facility that's been running for a while on 2 tiers using organics or living soils, please reach out to me and let me know, whoever's listening to this. But I do know some that are being set up right now that I'm following closely, looking forward to see how they turn out. And I hope to do some research with it, either at Goldleaf or my buddies at Legit, but we haven't gotten around to it yet.
Tad, I'll take that back. Mike and I are doing one currently. It's in design. It's a very, very small grow, maybe 930 square feet of bench area in a 2,000 square foot garage. This is a great example. And it is, in fact, my memory has been jogged. I do, in fact, have one that is 2-tiered organic soil. Is not yet built. It's been designed, but it's not yet been built. So we don't have data on it, but we'd be happy to follow up with you or get after his first harvest to get some data on it.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll reach out to you and Mike on that. Yeah. Yep. So take me through a little bit of the process if someone is going into this as a grower or as an investor or as a grower trying to set up a new facility. They would want to talk to someone like you, obviously, but there's other key players in this planning process. Who are those key players? Like, who do you think should be involved if someone's really interested in properly setting up a new grow facility?
So, yeah, that's a good approach or a good question. The way we approach that is that when I started this work 6 years ago in 2014, I didn't know what horticulture process engineering was. It was not, and I don't think I coined that term, but I certainly by 2019, last year, I don't do any jobs without a hort process engineer, and there are some great ones. I mentioned Mike Zartarian, Tony Van Ice is another one. There's some great folks around the country who serve that role, and so that's one of the primary things in the way we practice that's different. So first and foremost, it's because I'm humble. I don't claim to know everything. I'm not, growing plants is in my background. I actually grew up on a Christmas tree farm in Connecticut. So I have put things in the dirt and added soil and added lime and various nutrients, but I don't claim to be an expert on everything horticultural. So bringing on that expertise to my team is step one. understanding my customers' KPIs, key performance indicators, is really step two, because that is where the money comes from, right? Is that it's that promise that we make to our investors that allows us to operate. And so understanding those KPIs is key. So if manufacturing is part of the plan, then bringing in somebody with an expertise, let's say it's ethanol and ethanol extraction, and we'll bring in that person on our team. So, excuse me. So getting the team. I guess what I'm underscoring here is getting the team right. From the grower's perspective and from the entrepreneur's perspective, from the grower's perspective, it's about horticulture and it's about process and flow. From the entrepreneurs, from the C-suite, the CEO, CFO, COO, it's about those KPIs and managing the entire process. So we look at the entire process, meaning there's a facility, there's a whole building, and it's made up of certain key parts. Horticulture is first and foremost. Second is manufacturing. And the third is management of the employees, right? Understanding that the employees have a break room and that they have the right, bathroom and shower facilities. And so getting the team right is part of it. There's a lot of players that help at the various stages. So civil engineers that lay out parking and figure out the boundaries and the topography of the site and what can be put where. And so we work very closely with civil engineers on every job that we do, even if it's an existing building. We still have a civil engineer who is the one who really interfaces with the town when it comes to getting permits at the early stages. And we work closely with legal counsel with our customers, understanding what their obligations are legally, what their stage they're in the licensing process, so that the work in planning for the facility lines up neatly with their licensing process and with their capital draws when their funding is available. Because one of the hard things in cannabis, as everybody knows, is the start, stop. It's gas and brake. So we try to work with customers on sort of CapEx planning. In addition to team building, it's understanding when capital is needed and how much, so that our customer can talk intelligently to their funders and to say, here's a milestone, this is what the whole team is doing, and this is what it's going to cost to get to that milestone. And then here's the next milestone. And here's what the team needs to do to get to that milestone. And there's way down there in the distance, that's milestone number 3, and that's where we start to turn a profit. And we work with our customers to give them that ability to communicate at that level, right? So that you know what the milestone coming up is, you know who all your team members are that are contributing to the success of that milestone, and you can better evaluate risk. What's the risk if we don't hit the milestone, or if somebody tells us no when we get there? So it's about team building and then about good forecasting.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a little scary to me, just even when you say it like this. I think of all the steps and costs associated with setting up a new facility, and it can be pretty massive.
It's daunting.
Yeah, and realistically, there's so many hurdles along the way that people don't realize when they first get started. I mean, in some states like Oklahoma, it's fairly simple. In other states like where you are, it can be really challenging. So it's unfortunate. Like looking at it from a grower's perspective, myself, like all of this stuff is sort of things that I don't want to deal with. I don't even want to think about. I just want to get in there and start working with some plants. And
Right.
You can't do that. Like that's unfortunate, but it's the reality of the fact that if you want to do this commercially and legally, you have to start thinking of it like a business. And that's not to take away from the art and craft of cultivation and the science around cultivation. It's just, these are the steps that you're going to have to go through just to be able to allow the government to allow you to do what you want to do.
Ted, you reminded me of something. Yeah, we met at the PhotoX photobiology conference in Austin, Texas last year. One of the presenters there hit something home for me, which is that just because we like to grow it doesn't mean it's what the customer wants to buy. And I think that's a mantra that makes a lot of sense to me because I meet a lot of folks coming in and they point and they say, I want one of those, meaning a cultivation facility, right? And they don't yet know what their customer is demanding. They've never really polled their customers. There's just this sort of general attitude out there that everybody wants to buy weed. So if I can grow weed, I can mint money. And I think the industry is maturing now to a level where people really need to focus in on not just we're going to grow cannabis and we're going to grow really good cannabis and we're going to grow prize cannabis, but rather is understanding the customer base and saying which, are we selling only to boomer women, right, who are over 65 years old, right? Now you're focused down to a really specific customer group, understand what those people want, and produce what that demand dictates, right? That is a different idea that's the sort of business approach. Doesn't mean that you can't grow the best weed you've ever grown or get to grow the way you want to grow, but it's really understanding what is the output and who is it intended for.
That's a great point. Approach. That's a really good point because I know for a lot of growers, like high-end flower is sort of the end all be all. Yet here in Washington, the market has changed to where a lot of stuff is going, being made into distillate or edibles or even pre-rolls have become really popular. And it's funny because from a grower perspective, they're like, I can roll my own joint. I would rather see the flower and have good flower. But that's not necessarily what's moving off the shelves as quickly. And not everyone can produce high-end flower. Like there's only room for so many people at the top of that pyramid. So It is something to consider. What is your audience in all of this? I think that's a really good point. And that kind of transitions sort of to my next question. One of the things that you brought up, which wasn't a term that I was particularly familiar with when we started talking about it, was this idea of toll processing. Can you talk a little bit about what toll processing is and how it fits in the cannabis industry and what the potential is there?
We've seen a trend here in Massachusetts, which is that it's not that hard to spot, which is that there's a lot of profit to be made in processing, right? You're not just a farmer, field gating, at wholesale prices, but if you can turn it into a product, there's a much higher margin to be derived from at the end of the day. So we're actually when our customers now I'm seeing it over and over when they have a choice of phasing their construction based on limited dollars, our customers are choosing to build the processing facility first, and that's an interesting trend. And the next trend that I'm seeing, we have another customer who is specifically asked us to design the processing, which is extraction, post-extraction, the wipe film, the flowing film, the winterizing, and the to get to broad spectrum distillate, and the manufacturing piece to size that for a capacity that exceeds what they can grow. So if you have a way of estimating grow, let's take an average number of 40 grams, 42 grams per square foot, right? And you calculate from that you can do 5,000 pounds a year. Toll processing would be where you would create the capacity to handle 10,000 pounds a year. So there's 5,000 pounds of biomass that you can buy from other growers at wholesale and process and put out product. So toll processing, sort of like a toll road, means you pay to drive on it. So the processor who's doing toll processing is not just, in many cases, they're not just a processor. They're not just a manufacturer. They're also a grower, but they will actually buy in excess of what they can grow themselves at the wholesale, and then be able to manufacture more than what they could otherwise.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. Have you seen that occur on the other end, like on the propagation side? I know here in Washington, there was a company when we first switched over to rec called the Clone Zone, and they were able to fund their build out of a new facility based off of selling clones to the rest of the Washington market when it first got started, because everyone was looking for plants at the beginning. They had all the, hype cultivars at the time, and it was a really smart business move for them to provide starts for people. Now there's a lot of challenges from an IPM perspective and insects and liability around all those things, but the potential for a business opportunity there, I think, is really high in new states.
Well, I told you that I grew up on a Christmas tree farm, right? So there's not a Christmas tree farmer in the United States who grows their own tree from seedlings. The state fills that role. Almost everybody buys seedlings, which we would call a young plant coming, with a root system, from a supplier. Like what you're talking about now is a mature horticulture market. It's very similar in flowers. It's certainly true in trees. Think about every nursery you drive by. That's what they are. That's what that's what the name implies, right? It's a nursery. So for the landscape industry, that's what a mature market looks like, where you have different businesses set up to handle different stages of plant growth. I think cannabis is otherwise unique in the fact that it tackles the whole piece, and that's coming out of prohibition, right? That was a dictate because it's been under prohibition. I think as the industry matures, people will find business opportunities with small niches like that.
Yeah, and I think this idea of toll processing, to get back to that idea, really mitigates a lot of the risks associated with poor crop performance or crop loss.
Sure.
You know what you're buying. It's already a commodity at this point, and then you can manufacture it into whatever you want to manufacture, and you already know what the market will bear on that end. So the risk associated with it would be much lower, I would assume.
The risk is lower and the profit margin's higher. There's just the cost to get in is more expensive, though. As you know, when you've looked at ethanol processing equipment, that's expensive buy. It's not a cheap entry point. But the ROI is certainly there.
Yeah. So, Brian, just to change directions one last time here, one of the things that you and I talked about when we were waiting at the airport was some of the stuff you're doing around cannabis advocacy, and you were kind of sharing some of your thoughts around the direction of the cannabis industry on more of a national level. Do you want to talk a little about what you have going on that side of things?
I'll put in, sure, happy to. I'll put in two big plugs, shameless plugs to nonprofit organizations. I volunteer with the NCIA, the National Cannabis Industry Association. I put a lot of time in there. I chair a committee. We're called the Facilities Design Committee, as an appropriate place for an architect, I guess. And that's a committee that I actually started. Didn't exist before this year. I'm just coming up to the end of a one-year term. There's a great group of people. There's about 10 of us who are active from Sacramento to Boston. We meet meet once a month, and we're making some good progress. We'll be pushing out information for growers about facilities through the NCIA. There's a series of podcasts, not to compete with you, Tad, but there is NCIA does also host podcasts. Look for some information there. NCIA does webinars. I misspoke there, webinars. And they obviously have, they trade shows as well. So there's one coming up in San Francisco at the end of September. And so those are three ways in which the NCIA's Facility Design Committee is going to get information out. So I'm happy to talk about that. It's a good organization. It has, its main mission is advocacy at the federal level, but I think it does a pretty good job as well of getting information out to members and to non-members alike. The other group is out of Portland, Oregon. They're called RII, Resource Innovation Institute. RII Resource Innovation Institute. Derek Smith is the director, and I volunteer a lot with them. We just did a webinar last week for Michigan growers called Efficient Yields, and you can find more information on their website, RII's website, about their Efficient Yields webinar program for Michigan. There's more coming up, and then they've got one slated for Massachusetts growers as well. I think they do a really good job of harnessing when you want to have a discussion around sustainability and efficiency in energy consumption and water consumption and utility, how to interface with the utilities. RII is doing a lot of good work in getting growers to talk to utility people. I think that's an important step, right? We used to run away from the utilities because they were the people who would report us to the police kind of thing. Today it's different. An early relationship with the utilities is really key to a facility's success, right? Getting your power on time, getting it non-interrupted, getting the right amount of power or gas, if it's a gas pipeline or electrical service. RII does a really good job of advocating for growers and bringing growers and utility companies together in discussions around energy efficiency. So a big plug for Derek Smith.
Well, and hopefully getting your rebate too in states where that's applicable, like here in Washington. That's a lot of money. Yeah.
No, these are high six figures, right? High six figures that our customers are getting back. And you talked about the difference in cost, right? The high cost of LED lighting fixtures. There's many claims out there that the cost is based on the fact that the rebates are out there, right? If you can pay $330 for a double-ended HPS, why would you spend $1,200 to $1,500 for an LED light fixture? Well, many of the reasons is because in certain states, 70% of that delta is paid for by the utility, right? That brings that cost down enormously. So talking early to your utility about rebates is key to the success of a grow. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll be sure to put on the website page links to both of those websites as well as your website so people can check that out on the podcast page. Yeah.
Very cool.
Well, Brian, I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and I look forward to talking and hopefully working with you in the future.
Tad, has been awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we've been talking about this for a while. I'm glad it happened. Thanks, man.
Yeah. All right. Have a great day, Brian. Thank you.
Be well.
That was Brian Anderson with Anderson Porter Design, and you were listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. Don't forget to check out our website at www.kisorganics.com for more information and resources and links to topics we discussed on the show today. And please give us a follow on Instagram at kisorganics so you can stay up to date on our grower profile series and virtual live tours. I've also been documenting a greenhouse trial with tomatoes and malted barley on there, and we've done a couple of virtual live tours already. We toured Maine Craft Cannabis and Simply Green Farms in Oklahoma. I have other tours lined up with David Bernard Perrone to tour the largest organic cannabis facility in the world, and some others from all around the United States. This is a great chance to see inside these grows and ask questions directly live to the growers. Thanks for listening.